Today we're going to talk about, we're going to deal with chapter 4. It has to do with methods of studying culture and psychology. Normally I find the research chapter is just boring as hell. But in this case, when we talk about cultural psychology, the methods of studying culture are just fascinating because a lot of it has to do with how the researcher deals with the other culture, and they have to be sensitive to what that culture is looking for. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. Really fascinating stuff. I have to warn you that there is nudity in today's lecture. It mostly has to do with people trying to appropriate other people's cultures. And there are some interesting pictures. Not because the people are naked. Most of them are women. And you'll find it kind of surprising if you find a lot of bare chests. That's all we're going to be looking at, I think, as I remember. Anyway, yeah, this is really kind of fascinating stuff. What should always be the initial step in studying people from other cultures is to learn something about the culture under study. A little bit of knowledge can go a long way in avoiding costly and embarrassing mistakes. Let me give you a quick example. I had a colleague at Ashford who'd been a sociologist for almost 60 years. And he liked to write books. He liked to write books about different groups. It was really kind of interesting. But a lot of times the information that he had was not complete. He had a friend who was Caucasian that was married to a Meskwaki woman. The Meskwaki, another name for the Meskwaki, are the Fox. You may have heard about them, Sac and Fox tribes, where the two kind of came together. But the Meskwaki live in Iowa, and he was living in Clinton, Iowa, and the Meskwaki are in the middle of the state. So every summer he would go visit his friend. Now his friend was white, and he was married. He was married to a Meskwaki woman, and they lived off the tribal lands. They lived in a housing development just outside of Des Moines. So every year he would go visit him, and he would have long conversations with him. So he decided he was going to write a book about the Meskwaki. Now, all of these visits that he made to his friend off the reservation, who was married to a Meskwaki woman, who actually wanted to seem white. She really wasn't into her culture or anything. But so he decides he's going to write a book about the Meskwaki. And when I got there, of course, I just come back from Montana, where I'd lived on the reservation, or just off the reservation, for 10 years, and I'd dealt with. I'd become part of the community. I was adopted into both tribes. Lots of interesting things had happened. So we started having conversation, and he started telling me how wrong I was about American Indians. He knew, because he was a sociologist, and he had this friend that lived just off the Meskwaki reservation and was married to a Meskwaki woman. So he knew about American Indians better than I did, even though his experience involved 2 weeks every other summer near the Meskwaki reservation. He was a bit of an alcoholic, and I think the two of them probably drank themselves, or they drank a lot while they were discussing whatever it was they were discussing. So he went ahead and wrote his book, and it was off. It was so far off. He saw the world from his own point of view. He was kind of he was kind of arrogant. He had graduated from Berkeley. University of California at Berkeley, 50 years ago, 55 years ago. And because of that, he thought he knew everything about everything, that they had taught him how to be a good sociologist. And the reality was that most of his knowledge was incomplete at best, and sometimes it was just completely false. Anyway, we used to have conversations, and he liked to tell me how wrong I was about American Indians. Schwader and his colleagues in 1997 were researching family meals. They sought information from rural India and called ahead to optimize their time there. Though people in this area of rural India did not participate in family meals, an obliging local psychologist convinced a family to sit down at a table to simulate what the researchers were looking for. The researchers happily recorded their discovery and mistakenly included it in their research. Now, this is what they saw. They saw a family sitting down to a family meal. But this is what it actually is. This is how they eat. The males eat together. They don't eat at a table. And the females, of course, are the ones who prepare the food. They eat with the children. But the men eat together, and the women eat together. This is the way it actually is. But because that's what they were looking for, this is what they saw. And so they included it in their research, when in the reality it was the very opposite. One can learn about another culture in a variety of ways. The simplest way is to read existing texts and ethnographies about the culture. However, learning about a culture through books and ethnographies limits you to learning about the ideas the author thought were relevant. And of course, the other thing that you need to remember when you're dealing with a book, even a textbook, is that book is dated. If it was written 5 years ago, then the information is 5 years old. If we were talking about phrases that teenagers use, well, 5 years ago, the phrases the teenagers were using back then are completely different from the way they are today. So if we were at my friend who visited close to the tribal lands every year for 2 weeks, his information was very dated. Another approach is to find a collaborator who is from the culture you were studying and who is interested in pursuing the same research with you. The more involved your collaborator is in the project, the more likely you will get accurate information. And there's always a possibility that people will give you the wrong information. Once upon a time, the Catholic Church went to the Fort Belknap Reservation in the 1850s, 1860s. And they sent priests up there from Washington, D.C. They tried to learn everything they could about especially the Gros Ventre, the Ahani men culture. They tried to learn everything that they could. Of course, everything has changed over time. They've lost select things. But the priest that went up there wrote a book, and the book has to do with all the cultural aspects of the Gros Ventre people. It's called the Yellow Books, and I have them somewhere. I'm not sure where I've got them. Anyway, they're called the Yellow Books. So now, people that don't know about the Gros Ventre culture, even the Gros Ventre, they read this book and they take it as a Bible. And I asked them one time, somebody that was doing research, somebody who was a Gros Ventre and doing research, I asked them, how do you know that this is accurate? A lot of times, people some things are secret and they don't get that information out. And they said, well, we know. Which, genetically I know, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So it was an interesting conversation. There are a lot of things that are secrets. You guys have secrets that certainly you don't want me to know. But this is information that isn't going to get out to other people. The International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology is an organization of researchers studying culture and psychology from all around the world. And its members routinely find members from other countries to collaborate with cross-cultural projects. Another effective strategy is to immerse oneself in another culture to learn it firsthand. This is an excellent way to gain a rich understanding of another culture, but it can be time-consuming and costly. There is no substitute for first-hand experience, and this is one of the pictures I was warning you about. These African women who normally don't wear shirts are a little surprised that this very pale person is topless. In 1997, Patricia Greenfield was doing field research about the making of textiles in Mexico. She gave the Zinacantecos women the same survey about their textile making that she had used all over the world. The women became angry. The Zinacantecos women approached the survey as they would a conversation. When Greenfield asked similar questions, a methodologically sound interview technique, they thought she was stupid or making fun of them, and it made them angry. Having your methods perceived in identical ways across different cultures is termed methodological equivalence. Now, the assumption is that if I ask somebody a question, even though English or their language may not be my first language, the assumption is that what I think I'm saying, I'm actually saying. But the reality may be different. Every language has its own nuance. Sometimes researchers have to adapt their procedures so that it is understandable in each culture equally, and that's really tough. This has to do with negotiations, and in negotiations, sometimes you say something and you think that what you're thinking is what they're thinking, but the reality is that they may be interpreting what you're saying completely different. Let me give you a good example. A good example is World War II. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had been warning us that they might attack us, that they found us, they considered us their enemy. They'd been telling us this for a number of years, and because we speak the English language and we don't speak Japanese, and we didn't understand the Japanese culture. It wasn't important enough for us to understand. We didn't understand what they were saying. They were telling us that it may happen. If you a good example of this is the movie Mr. Baseball with Tom Selleck. He's a baseball player, goes to Japan, gets in all kinds of trouble because he doesn't understand their culture. And when they say one thing, they may mean something else as far as he's concerned. And he didn't recognize that. He was warned. He was warned that this girl was dangerous and he shouldn't date her. But he didn't acknowledge what the individual was saying. So there's a culture shock. The two cultures just didn't. He didn't understand the Japanese culture, and of course, at first he really disliked it. But then eventually, of course, it all came together, and that's the whole point of the story. So the problem is that even though we're listening to things, so what happened with the Japanese? The Japanese had been warning us and warning us and warning us, and if we had studied Japanese history, we would have known that sneak attacks are the best. They are legitimate as far as the Japanese are concerned. If you are weaker than somebody else, a sneak attack is perfectly ethical. But of course, we were quite appalled when the Japanese attacked us, and so then we went to war and we defeated them. But the idea was that if we'd been listening all along, we'd have been better prepared for the war. The vast majority of cross-cultural research has been conducted between industrialized societies. The most common comparisons are between North Americans and East Asians, and it's funny. The differences between Asians and Americans, the ideas behind things. Studying college students from different cultures also lends itself to making meaningful comparisons, as students the world over tend to be familiar with many of the kinds of procedures used in psychological studies, and college students tend to be an accessible sample for most university researchers. When researchers overemphasize college students, there tends to be a significant problem with generalizability. The research can be generalized with any populations but other college students. Overusing student affects power. Power reflects the quality of the design of the study and determines if your design is sensitive enough to identify the anticipated effects. Sometimes the hypothesis is correct, but the design doesn't have the power to be able to provide support for it. So a lot of researchers are working at colleges, and it's a ready population. So they do all the research with college students. Now, most college students are traditional students. Right out of high school, they go to college, and they graduate in 4 years. Well, that makes them 22 years old when they graduate. If they graduated from high school at 18, they graduate from college at 22. So you've got a huge population of people between the age of 18 and 22. And that's who they're doing the research on. Now, the reality is that is representative of only people between the age of 18 and 22. It's not representative of people between the age of 14 and 18. It's not representative of people between 30 and 40, because they come from different generations. But the reality is most of our research comes out of colleges. And this is one of the reasons why when you're looking at research, I'm asking you to look at the population to see who they are and to see if this is a possible bias. In cross-cultural studies, culture should always be an independent variable. If researchers contrast two similar cultures, they would not have as much variance in their independent variable as if they had compared two very dissimilar cultures. Psychological concepts do not always translate from one culture to the next. The Japanese have something they refer to as ame, which has no equivalent in English. It is I guess codependence would be a good example, but we consider codependence as a pathology, and they don't consider ame a pathology at all. It's inappropriate behavior that shows dependence on someone else. Usually it's the male for the female. The female will have ame. In other words, he will insult her, he will be rude to her, yet she stays with him. That is ame, where she's willing to put up with his negative behavior. And he treats her very poorly. That is ame. The German Schadenfreude has no equivalent in English. It's the pleasant feeling from seeing someone else's pain. Schadenfreude, and this may be one of the reasons that the Germans had no problem with some of the things they did during World War II. It's because they enjoyed seeing other individuals suffer. It didn't bother them at all. Whereas, we may feel pity, we root for the underdog. They don't do that in Germany. If they see a game, they want to see a 12-0 blowout. If we're talking about soccer, if it's football, they want to see a 100-0 blowout. They want to see the other side suffer. So it's just part of the German mentality. This whole Schadenfreude thing. Ephilukfago has no equivalent in English. Fago was a mark of maturity that shows compassion for the weak and love and sadness for them. And of course, this is the very opposite of Schadenfreude. The Chinese have no translation for the word self-esteem. The Chinese are a collectivist culture, and the idea that you feel good about yourself doesn't really equate to the Chinese culture. Sign seen in a Chinese hotel: please don't accept strangler's invitation so as not to be cheated. Stranglers, they meant strangers, invitation. but they said stranglers, so I put the picture in there of a strangler. Sign in a Chinese store, please don't touch yourself. Let us help try you out. Which means to them, don't touch any of the merchandise, but they didn't say that, of course. They made it sound like the person is fondling themselves. Sign in a Cambodian hotel, wishing you a bong voyage. Of course, a bong is for smoking marijuana. Sign in Hong Kong bathroom for keeping toilet clean and tidy. Please dump at the dustbin. Now we might interpret that they wanted us to poop in the dustbin, but that's not what they meant, I'm sure. Sign on Japanese street when carrying a parasol. Please be careful to get it in the way of other people around you. And of course, that's not what they meant. That you will get in the way. Sign in a Japanese drugstore. We make up prescriptions. Well, they don't. They fill prescriptions. They don't make them up. Sign in a Bucharest hotel lobby. The lift is being fixed for the next day. During that time, we regret that you will be unbearable or angry. Actually, that's not what they mean. They won't be able to take you up and down the elevator. Sign in a Paris hotel. Please leave your values at the front desk. And of course, they meant valuables, but they said values instead. Sign in an Athens hotel. Visitors are expected to complain at the office between the hours of 9 and 11 a.m. daily. In other words, you're supposed to complain about something. Sign in a Japanese hotel. You are invited to take advantage of the chambermaid, which of course you can interpret in more than one way. Sign in a Paris dress shop. Dresses for street walking. Street walking, of course, is prostitution. When I lived in Germany from 79 to 82. They have streetwalkers. They have prostitutes that stand on the street and try to market themselves. The interesting thing about streetwalkers in Germany is that you can tell which people are streetwalkers and which people aren't by whether they cross their ankles. And they cross their ankles just like this. So they stand there with one ankle crossed over like that. And it indicates to the people driving by that they're open for business and that they are a streetwalker. Normally you don't stand like that, but this is the indication. This is the sign that they give that they're prostitutes. Sign in German campground. It is strictly forbidden on our Black Forest camping site that people of different sex, for instance men and women, live together in one tent unless they are married with each other for that purpose. Okay, so only men and women who are married. It doesn't sound like that's what they're saying. Soviet weekly newspaper, there will be a Moscow exhibition of arts by 15,000 Soviet Republic painters and sculptors. These were executed over the past 2 years, and it sounds like they were executing artists from the Soviet era. Sign in a Majorcan shop. Majorca is an island in the Mediterranean. Here, speaking American. And of course, they got the words kind of right, but they didn't quite put them together correctly. Even for relatively fluent speakers, word choice can be a problem. The most commonly used method of ensuring that a translation is accurate is to have someone translate the translation back into English. This technique is known as the back translation method. Response biases are factors that distort the accuracy of a person's response to surveys, and they become especially problematic when we compare groups that differ in their response biases. Some people will try to seem more socially desirable in their answers and disguise their true feelings to appear more socially desirable. And I'm going to read you this cartoon because this is really kind of interesting. This is Calvin and Hobbes. Hobbes is the toy tiger and Calvin is the little boy. I'm filling out a reader survey for Chewing magazine. See, they asked how much money I spend on gum each week. So I wrote $500. For my age, I put 43, and when they asked what my favorite flavor is, I wrote garcurry. garlic curry. This magazine should have some amusing ads soon. I love messing with data. And of course, he's just, like he said, he's messing with data. There is a tendency for people from different cultures to vary in terms of how likely they are to express their agreement in a moderate fashion. Choosing an item close to the end of the scale, the extremity bias, or choosing an item in the middle of the scale, the moderacy bias, are two ways that people do this. And if you've ever taken a survey, half the time you're just putting there, yeah, maybe, whereas you actually may have an opinion, but you're writing maybe because you don't want to be offensive. Or maybe you're angry that day, so you use so you're feeling disagreeable, so you just disagree with everything. African Americans and Hispanic Americans tend to give more extreme responses than Americans of European descent. East Asians tend to be more moderate in their responses than European Americans. East Asians show a greater moderacy bias when they complete the materials in their native language than when they complete them in English. One of the things we learned when we lived in Japan was that the Japanese rarely will tell you no. They may mean no, but they rarely tell you no. And for this reason, you've got to be prepared to interpret what yes means, whether they actually mean yes or whether they mean no, because they say yes a lot, but they actually most often don't mean yes. This gets very confusing, I know, but it's part of their culture. Because it's a collectivist culture, they don't want to seem disagreeable. Because disagreement can lead to argument. Argument, of course, is something that they don't want to do. So it's really kind of fascinating watching these different cultures, dealing with these different cultures. One way to fix mediocrity and extremity bias is by having the respondent answer yes or no, rather than using a Likert-like scale. Though it is hard to quantify yes and no answers, that is basically the problem. And of course, you take out the maybe, because everybody will just say maybe. A tendency to agree with most statements is known as acquiescence bias, and is an issue for cross-cultural comparisons. The acquiescence bias is a problem for cross-cultural research because cultures differ in their tendencies to agree with items. East Asians tend to have a relatively holistic way of looking at the world, and one consequence is that there are more possible truths in a holistic world. This tends to make them see truth in most statements. So that's the problem with the yes. They're always saying yes because I can see something in there that is positive, so that they'll just say yes, rather than explain to you what is negative and what's positive. People tend to evaluate themselves by comparing themselves with others, usually with similar others, the people that they grew up with. I just read a book about somebody from Senegal, and he was talking about his age cohorts. And these are the individuals that he grew up with, and he was saying he couldn't marry somebody from his age cohort because they were like his brothers and sisters. It's the tribe that he came from, the Fula in Senegal. They raised children in a group manner. So the children that were your same age, you ran around with all the time. And it was easier for the families to just kind of lump these kids together and take care of them all together. But it was taboo for you to marry somebody from your own cohort group. So that's what we do. We compare ourselves with the people that we went to school with. When we were fifth graders, it was all the fifth graders that we compared ourselves with. We didn't compare ourselves with the seventh graders. We certainly didn't compare ourselves with third graders because they were younger and older than we were, and they weren't anything like us. When we are assessing ourselves in terms of how tall, intelligent, or punctual we are, what matters is how tall, intelligent, or punctual we view ourselves compared to most other people around us. It's really kind of interesting because my grandson is playing up, which means that he's playing with older boys. He's in the fourth grade and he's playing on a fifth grade team. So most of the kids that he plays with are larger than him. Now, if he were playing on a fourth grade team, everybody would be about the same. They would all be the same age, but they would also be about the same height and the same skill level. But he's playing up because his skill level is a little bit more advanced than the fourth grade skill level. But the kids are a lot bigger than he is. Some of them are a head taller than he is. And it's because they've hit their growth spurt. He's a year younger, so he hasn't hit his growth spurt yet. Really kind of fascinating comparing who you compare yourself with. Reference group effect is critical for cross-cultural research because people from different cultures tend to evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to different reference groups and thus to different standards. Understanding the reference group conundrum, the researcher should always be aware of the reference group effect. So here we have a girl from Japan. She wants to be Reese Witherspoon. That's what she wants to look like. Of course, it's not going to happen with her black hair. Most Japanese have very dark hair. She has cat's eyes. She has more angled eyes than a Caucasian woman does, and her facial features aren't the same. Now, why this very cute girl would want to look like this also cute girl, but who doesn't look anything like her, I don't know. Anyway, I never understand these things, why people want to look like somebody else. One classic example of reference group effect was a study done looking at African American soldiers in 1949 while the South was still suffering through Jim Crow. The soldiers were less satisfied about living in the North than living in the repressive South. Could it be that they didn't like the better treatment and the obvious freedoms that they found in the North? And if you know anything about the history of the Jim Crow era, African Americans were limited as to where they could go. They couldn't drink out of water fountains. They had to only drink out of colored water fountains. They couldn't sit. They had to sit up in the balcony at a theater. They couldn't even wait in the same waiting room if they were at the bus station or train station. And that was Jim Crow South. And now, so why in the world would the African American soldiers in 1949 like the South better than the North? With the analysis, they found that the soldiers gave their answers because they were using local African Americans as their reference group. Because African Americans were better off in the North than the South, the soldiers' life was more satisfying in the South by comparison. So they saw themselves as being treated more equally in the North. Everybody was being treated more equally. But when they compared themselves with the repressed Southern African Americans, they found themselves in a much better position. And they liked that better. When asked how much people valued enjoying life and pleasure, the results showed that the dour East Germans, who you couldn't get them to smile unless blood was involved, remember, Schadenfreude, scored the third highest on the survey. And this doesn't make any sense for a couple different reasons. For one thing, Germany is pretty cloudy. You don't see sun very often, and if it gets over 80 degrees, that's a heat wave, and they just go gaga over sun, but they never see the sun, and it's usually somewhere in the 60s throughout the summer. And then, of course, the winters are relatively cold. And this is mostly in northern Germany, where it rains a lot. So why in the world would their enjoying life and pleasure factors, why would they be so high? Italians who maintain a lifestyle emphasizing good life, leisurely breaks in cafes, opera and art, and long summer vacations came in next to last on the enjoying life and pleasure scale. Now, this didn't make any sense. It's nice and sunny down in Italy. They love their food. They love their wine. They sing all the time. And here you have the Germans who run around looking like this all the time. They never smile. You can't get them to smile unless, like it says, unless there's blood involved. And here's the Italians. They sing and they love life. So why in the world would they come in so low on the survey? On the humility scale, the arrogant Americans scored higher on the scale than the humble Japanese. The collectivist Chinese scored higher on the choosing one's own goals scale than the individualistic Americans. So what in the world's going on? This is known as the deprivation effect. The deprivation effect involves people valuing things that they have little of rather than what they have in abundance. Thus, since there is a dearth of humbleness among Americans, they value humility more than the Chinese who were taught humility from birth. So this is what's going on here. This is why the Germans scored so high on enjoying life and pleasure. Since they had very little of it, that's what they desired. That's what they focused on. The Italians, who have it in spades, instead of focusing on it, it's something that's very common. For that reason, of course, they scored lower because it wasn't that important to them, even though they enjoyed life a lot more than most people do, and enjoying pleasure more than anybody else. So this is known as the deprivation effect. So this is one of the things you have to be careful of when you're talking to groups of individuals from different cultures. Subjective self-report measures work fine within cultures because cultural members tend to share the same response biases and reference groups. But subjective self-report measures do not work well between cultures because the members have different response styles and different reference groups. And this is one of the reasons why there's such an argument right now going on between African Americans and non-African Americans. African Americans' reference group is completely different. So when we talk about racism, during Jim Crow was so much worse than it is today. But people say racism is just as bad. Now, why is that? Why is racism, why do people feel that racism is just as bad now as it was back in the 1950s? And the answer is because the reference groups are different. So back then, you grew up with a certain degree of racism. I mean, you saw that as normal, and your reference group were people who were also suffering the same thing. So they didn't see themselves as repressed as people today, where they have more freedoms. Seeing that they could have more freedoms, they see racism as rampant. Cross-cultural studies are possible, but one variable that can not be manipulated is cultural background. The comparisons of cultures are not true experiments, but quasi-experiments. Culture cannot be controlled, but other independent variables, of course, can. After randomly assigning subjects to groups, a researcher can administer different levels of the independent variable to each group. Any differences in their responses or behaviors that are observed must be due to the independent variable, as this is the only thing that differs systematically between the experimental conditions. A second method of doing cross-cultural research is within-group manipulation. Each participant receives more than one level of the independent variable. Within-group manipulation does not require random assignment because each participant receives each level of the independent variable. Each participant also acts as their own control. Past research has explored cultural messages in domains as diverse as magazine advertisements. This was done by Han and Shavit in 1994. This is an Oreo milk commercial from Korea. And as you can see, the baby is attached to his mother's breast and holding an Oreo cookie. Now, this is quite appropriate as far as the Koreans are concerned. Probably wouldn't float in the United States. Past research has explored cultural messages in domains as diverse as laws. This was done by Cohen in 1996. China passed a law in 2013 that adult children must visit their parents often. Now, how do you interpret the word often? That's not a law that we would pass in the United States. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as newspaper articles. This was done by Morris and Penn in 1994. Most headlines around the world were about President Trump's inauguration, but from the country's point of view. And this is France. No, this is Canada. Anyway. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as fairy tales. This was done by Doyle and Doyle in 2001. The oldest written fairy tale is Abdullah the Fisherman and Abdullah the Merman, written in 850 AD in Persia. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as children's stories. Stories from around the world. McClellan did this in 1961. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as sports coverage. This was done by Marcus Uchida, Omaregi, Townsend, and Katayama in 2006. And of course, this is incorrect. That should be et al. And take out all of these. Anyway, it's really kind of fascinating because if we look at in the United States, we have a lot of pictures, we have a lot of stories. In Europe, all of the newspapers are Homer newspapers. So a London newspaper would not talk about Manchester United or Manchester City or Liverpool. They talk about the London soccer teams with very few pictures. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as personal ads. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as web pages. A key point to realize about research is that no single study is perfect. Every study has potential methodological shortcomings or alternative theoretical explanations. One important skill that students learn in graduate school in psychology is precisely how to come up with alternative explanations for virtually any study they encounter. And of course, this is one of the things that you have to think about. This is one of the reasons why we're teaching you to read research articles and to be cynical about the research article. Is this true or is this not true? And of course, this joke demonstrates that. Do you think all these film crews brought on global warming, or did global warming bring on all these film crews? And that is an interesting way of looking at things. In research, researchers and readers of research use the principle of Occam's razor to help with determining the quality of research. Occam's razor states that any theory should make as few assumptions as possible, shaving off any extraneous assumptions. All else held equal, Occam's razor maintains that the simpler the theory is, more correct. Following Occam's razor, a single explanation is more parsimonious and more likely to be correct than 4 separate explanations. And that's Occam's razor. So if you watch Big Bang Theory, of course, they talk about Occam's razor from time to time. And now it's a very popular term. It's a common term because it was on a television show, a very popular television show. Research has always shown that the South is the most violent region in the United States, and that this has been true since the very founding of the nation. According to de Tocqueville in 1835, he saw the same thing. While violence exists in other regions of the country, the Old West, the South has led the nation in lynchings, sniper attacks, feuds, homicides, and duels for the history of the United States. So this is the most dangerous place in the United States. This is the South. And as you can see, the South accounted for, what is this? What year is this? 2012 violent crimes. It had 40.9% of all the reported violent crimes occurred in the South. In the Northeast, 194,609 as compared to 496,773. The Midwest, 238,000. The West, 284,000. 83.4% of robberies occurred in streets or highways. Aggravated assaults accounted for 62.6% of violent crimes. Firearms are used in 69.3% of murders reported. And there you go. Anyway, the South is a much more violent place. Andrew Jackson, who's on your $20 bill, once killed a man in a duel over the honor of his wife, who at the time was married to both Jackson and her first husband, while she waited for a divorce to be finalized. Fisher in 1989 speculates that the South has always been has had more tolerance for aggressive pursuits. Reports from the colonial days chronicles no-holds-barred fighting, where eyes were gouged and noses and ears were bitten off. Or purring, where two men held each other's shoulders and kicked each other in the shins until one let go. Now they were able to, this is what purring looks like, they're able to put straw in their pants to lessen the blow. But this is an activity. The South has always been more tolerant than the North concerning corporal punishment of children, capital punishment of criminals, gun ownership, going to war whenever the gauntlet is mentioned. Southern high school students are more likely to bring a weapon to school. The South has more school shootings. There have been several theories as to why the South has evolved one way and the rest of the country another. It's hot and uncomfortable temperatures in the South. That's according to Anderson, 1989. Greater poverty, de Tocqueville in 1835. Longer history of slavery where there is a tolerance for inhumane treatment, and that's according to de Tocqueville as well. Nisbet and Cohen in 1996 posit that one of the factors that has led to more violence in the South is that the South was settled by herders, which has given rise to a culture of honor. A culture of honor is one where men strive to protect their reputation through aggression. Herders are more susceptible to violence because their wealth is more portable or the land is more marginal. Thus, it is important for herders to develop a reputation of violent retaliation to keep thieves away from their wealth, a culture of honor. The sense of honor has to be established before your wealth is affected. Thus, you need to be violent before anyone tries to steal your livestock. A good example would be cattle rustling was a capital offense. If you were a cattle rustler and you got caught, then they hung you. Didn't have anything to do with murder. It had to do with stealing people's livestock. The herder culture of honor is not limited to the United States, but may have been brought here by the Scots-Irish, who made up the lion's share of people settling in the South. They were herders in the old country. Herders around the world maintain this bloviated code, where you have to prove that you you have to punish people who try to steal your livestock. Looking at archival data, Nisbet and Cohen in 1997 found that when you compared records of the rural North with the rural South, they found that not only was the homicide rate higher, but when they compared herding regions of the South with farming regions of the South, the homicide rate was twice that in the herding region. Cohen and Nisbet in 1994 next conducted telephone interviews of Northerners and Southerners and discovered that while they had similar negative feelings about violence, Southerners were more likely to have positive attitudes toward defending their families or their honor. Noting that testosterone rises when men are ready to aggress, Nisbet and Cohen et al. In 1996 arranged for Northern and Southern students to be put in a vaguely insulting situation. He then measured the testosterone of each participant. Measuring testosterone from saliva samples, the researchers discovered that while the Northern students reacted minimally to the insult, from 4 to 5 milligrams, the Southern students were ready to aggress after the insult to a testosterone level of 12.5 milligrams from a level before of 4 milligrams, so their testosterone had tripled. Cohen and his colleagues in 1996 conducted a similar study where they forced the participants into a narrow hallway with a much larger person. What they were measuring was how long it took the participants to step out of the way of the man mountain. A game of human chicken is what they were doing. So they had a football player coming toward them that they needed to get out of his way because the hallway was only large enough for one person. The situation was set up by either insulting the participant before they played hallway chicken or not. Northerners reacted in a similar manner whether they were insulted or not. They got out of the way at 60 to 75 inches, respectively. Southerners, on the other hand, stepped out of the way earlier when they were not insulted. They stepped out of the way at 110 inches. Of course, that's Southern hospitality. But after an insult, they approached the man mountain on an average of 35 inches before veering off. 35 inches is about a yard. And of course, that has to do with the culture of honor. And that is the end of the chapter, as fascinating as all that is. So culture is really important as far as research is concerned. And you need to always take culture into consideration when you're dealing with any type of research. And that's the end of the chapter. So I'll talk to you guys next week.